Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where I talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the series premiere of the Lazarus Project. A great series premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. This show hit the ground running, and I guess it kind of makes sense, especially it being on the shorter side. It's only 8 episodes, which obviously it's kind of interesting to call that short, considering 8, 10, that's kind of around the normal ballpark nowadays for most shows. I mean, and obviously this being a British show makes a lot of sense. Like in the 6 to 8 episode apartments, kind of roughly in the average, I think. But either way, like the fact is, we hit the 6-minute mark, I think, roughly speaking, in the episode, and that's when we hit the reset and everything. So obviously we get introduced to George, him and Sarah's life, and obviously it's a lot of it's one of those shows where it's like Station 11 and The Last of Us and Sweet Tooth, where it's like these pandemic stories. Because especially in this universe where it's like, oh, coronavirus happened, and then we're also going into another pandemic because MERS has mutated and turned into something else. But getting introduced to George's life and how, but you can tell already with this, knowing what the concept of the story was. I knew it was a time travel story. What I was surprised by is like, oh, this is 6 months later, and we rewind back to, because I kept wondering if once again, it's been a long time since I saw the trailer, so in my head, I kept thinking, like, maybe this was on, like, a day rewind, like it was very Groundhog's Day, which it still is, but it's on a much larger scale. Once again, time loop stuff can happen to that. It just varies from the story, because some stories are like, hey, you lived this whole time frame, and then, whoops, we're back to Groundhog Day, where everything ended up restarting. More often than not, it's usually in, like, roughly a 24-hour period. Once again, the time frame changes, but I wasn't expecting the 6 months time frame. I'm like, that's a huge time frame, and I get, and with the implication of what the story is, and depending on how things play out, that time frame could always get shorter. Of like, hey, things might get expedited on this particular run, and it's ends up being shorter. So it's like, hey, normally the time frame is, well, things pop off and we end up having to restart after 6 months. Well, now we're going to have to restart after 3 months because something expedited. And I could definitely see them playing with that a lot more as the show progresses. So it's almost this interesting thing because they obviously make the parallel to video games, and it is very much of like, yeah, it's a speed run. Like your time frame of beating a game is shorter and shorter. So that is kind of interesting to kind of like apply it in this regard to the story. But, like I said, they hit the ground running a lot sooner than I thought they would, because it's like, hey, George and Sarah are both sick. She's pregnant at the time. They got married. You could definitely tell something was up when Carl was like, yeah, she's a good woman. It's like, no, she's a really good woman. You're like, so it doesn't seem like her and Carl have history. It's like Carl's always been in like love with her. So, but it's like, right, but maybe in that time frame, he's always been in love with her, but Sarah's never known. And like, or maybe he fell in love with her after George and Sarah had gotten, whatever the case may be, like, it was pretty clear. I was like, that's weird. And that ends up being kind of a crucial point to this story. So when that's all said and done, though, the rewind, and obviously it's interesting too that this all kind of pops off on the second time through, because you're like, wait, he's kind of like, because at first you're like, he could tell like this is some deja vu stuff going on, but you thought like, hey, maybe he played it out the entirety the same way, but it didn't, because like he's like, okay, he screwed up like the situation where he was trying to make his app, he's trying to get a loan for his app, that didn't go through, but also considering what his app is all about, that's also very like there is a serendipity, like it's reciprocal. Like, I always butcher the word. It's very in tune with what the story is, because the app he wants to do, it takes all these variables, it takes all these elements and kind of tells you where things might be going in a certain direction. So it works on like a business scale of like, you can decide like what wave or what trend you're going to follow, because you're going to be like, hey, this is going to go this way because of these particular factors. So it's like, right, that's so in tune with the very project. So he is kind of the perfect person to be a part of a time travel project. So, but yeah, the second run did not go well. The first run is like, hey, everything was great. The second run, not as much. And then I also we did immediately get an answer, not immediately, but we eventually got an answer of like, why is it he remembers? Like, I was like, does anyone else? Like, how does that work? But we find out that we don't know what it is at this point in time, but it does seem like there is I guess maybe there's something you have to add to your genetic makeup to make it so that you remember. but there are people who are mutants who are like the super, super, super rare people who are mutants who naturally will remember these. And as it kind of gets described by Archie later, these cast aside timelines. So it is kind of like in the more, probably like more traditional time travel stuff of like, yeah, in the moment you rewind time, that timeline disappears. Because that's always been my thing about wondering with time travel about how you handle the multiple timelines thing. Do they coexist of like, oh, this timeline is abandoned, so like there's no more timeline A, it's now timeline B, or timeline C, or eventually timeline D. So I was curious like how that would work. Well, it's not even timeline D anymore, but we'll get to that in a second. So I was curious how that worked, but she says like, the way she talks about Archie makes it seem like those timelines, the moment they reset, those timelines are dead. They're gone forever, which, you know, kind of tackles like the Magicians, where it's like those timelines are gone and you can't access them, but under very special circumstances you can. I doubt the show will really kind of go into that because we don't know the full capabilities of the time travel. It doesn't seem like it works in the more, because it's not even a time travel machine. It works in a very specific way. And even the show is like, yeah, we're not going to explain how it works because you aren't smart enough to fully comprehend all of it. Maybe the show will eventually kind of break down how it works, but for now it's like it go too far over your head, because it's like, can it be used to go back further? And I love Archie's answers of, I'm a brown woman. Why the fuck would I want to go back to the 1800s? And even George had to be like, fair. Just the number one thing of like, if you're white, it's fine. You can time travel up and down time if you want to. If you're a minority, that's super not going to be like really good. Also, I kept wondering why I recognized the actress who played Archie. I was wondering if she's who I thought she was. And yes, her name is, I'm going to butcher it, but Anjali Mohindra. I was like, is she who I think she is? So I looked into it, and she is. She plays Beatrix in the show The Peripheral on Prime Video, which is just funny because it's like, this is coming out after season 1 of that already came out, but this came out obviously last year, and The Peripheral came out, wasn't it like earlier this year when that came out? I think so. It's been a couple months. So it's funny how that works. I mean, you'd assume like this got filmed like way before then because it came out last year, but I mean, you never know with filming and stuff like that, but I just thought that was interesting. And I was like, I thought that's who it was, but I wasn't sure, so. I really like her character in both this show and her character in The Peripheral. But either way, I kind of skipped over stuff, but I do like that. Like I said, George was kind of like, because he was in the process of figuring things out, he was kind of not handling things in the original, like they went down in the original time, because he's like, no, wait, I've already done this before. Because it's one thing if you're like, hey, like a more traditional Groundhog Day of like, oh, that must have been deja vu. It's one thing when it's in a day. That's why they make it 6 months to make it even better of like, no, I can't be going crazy. I lived 6 months of my life. We got married. The virus ended up spreading. You got pregnant. He even tried to get his girlfriend, Sarah, to take a pregnancy test, but she's like, I'm not going to do that. And I was like, because she's like, you sound crazy, because who knows if like she's pregnant at this point in time. We know she just dropped it in his cup like on one day, but we don't know like whether it's just like, hey, like, I mean, it never came up, so it might be a thing of they never had sex in that period for her to get pregnant. It's just like he didn't get the loan, and he was kind of like figuring everything out, and he was scaring his girlfriend. She's getting advice from Carl, which later on they end up dating. So it's like, cool. That makes any restart of the timeline, you're immediately like, man, fuck Carl. I already know you were trying to get my girlfriend regardless, but now I know it's like, cool. If I wasn't in the picture, you'd swoop in to be like, oh, the friend you can lay your shoulder, like, I'll be that shoulder you can cry. And it's like, you are the scum of the earth, where you're just like, you're a leech waiting, you're a weasel just waiting for your opportunity. So it makes you kind of super scummy of like, because it makes your friendship fake, because you're just like, hey, I'm being a supportive friend, when in actuality it's like, no, I'm trying to get with you. Like, it makes you super scummy, and it's just like, it kind of sucks where you're just like all alone having to go through this pandemic as things get worse and people are dying. But Archie got introduced herself to George, and it's like, right, once you reset again, come find me. So it is that wonderful moment of like, hey, waking up their third time through this, and it's like, oh baby, you're still here. It's like, I love you, kissing her, and it's like, yeah, I'm not gonna take you for granted, because it's like, yeah, that's the benefit of everything resetting. Like, But that's also the drawback of like, once again, like if things are good in the timeline, like the first time through, and you have to reset, man, that's you have to make sure everything plays out the same way if you want the time frame to play out the way you want it to. Like if everything was good like it was the first time through, man, oh man, is that going to complicate things. So you'd have to make sure you keep everything exactly the same, because obviously the smallest change could have the biggest impact. Once again, he was someone trying to figure everything out, and he was going a little crazy. So it's not just like, oh, you didn't get the loan. I mean, so everything else didn't play out the same. I mean, it's more so like his attitude and just him being like, yo, this is going on. No one believes me. I sound crazy. That played a bigger role than you not getting the loan, but it did put you in a position where she wasn't keen on having a kid because you didn't have the money. Things didn't work out because of the loan. Like, because the loan working out, you got that, gave you the head start you needed to get the app going. So you had the money to take the jump to, have a child and then getting married. So it all worked out. And so it does play into it, but you being crazy, being like, oh, I lived 6 months of her life, it's going to make you seem nuts. So he goes and meets Archie. She explains everything about what they do, what the Lazarus Project is. So it isn't a more traditional time travel. There is no machine. There ain't no splintering like in 12 Monkeys. I have to bring that up because 12 Monkeys is my favorite time travel story. It's my favorite science fictional show. It's so good. It's so good if you've never seen it. And if you're watching this and listening to this and you like Lazarus Project, I think you're really going to like 12 Monkeys. It's in the same vein. It's just so good. Okay, so I'm going to shut my mouth about that. But yeah, there's no splintering or time machine. It's literally a singularity in the sky. And I love that she, once again, going back to the video game metaphor, basically every year on the same date of July 1st, that's the new restart point. That's why they keep going back to 6 months, because, and that's the wild thing to think about. Like, so for example, if things played out a certain way and it's like, hey, this is July 1st, 2022. If something happens on July 30th before you get that clock over into the next reset, you're still going to go the entire year back. It's like, oh, like you were almost about to hit that year point on July 30th, 11:59, the world ended, everything automatically like rewound before you got to that reset. Then boom, it does seem like they do have some control over when they have the reset, because jumping ahead, Wes did say like, hey, code black, meaning like, we need to start the reset now. So, but it's like that moment of like, yeah, rewind these 12 months and gotta live the whole year over again. Once again, there's a lot of stuff you can do and play with that. There's a lot of room to kind of utilize and play with time travel rules like that, which I've never, I'm not saying there's no story that hasn't done it, but I've never seen anything kind of utilize time travel in this manner. So there's that. And obviously they're an organization. They're people from different backgrounds, because Archie's like MI5. There's someone from like the Jaeger Corps, or one's, I think, was it Greta's like she's like a police officer, I think. Like they're all from different backgrounds, and then you have George, who is from like, hey, I make apps. And they're like, oh, cool. But it's like, yeah, because literally everyone else on that project, with the exception of Shiv, was chosen. So it's like, because of your background and what you can do, because their point is to, hey, scientifically, militaristically, we try to fix things. And time travel is kind of like the last resort. It's not meant to be like the answer to everything. It's meant to be like if the last resort calls for it. Because this organization has existed for a very, very long time. And their thing isn't like every bad thing in the world. It's like, because, bringing up your good, like, typical time travel things of like, it didn't get brought up, but it's like, why don't you go back in time and kill Hitler? Why didn't you stop like 9/11 from happening? It's like, because it didn't end the world. Yes, it had trickle effects of, yes, there was war in the Middle East because of it, but in the grand scheme of things, it didn't lead to the end of the world. Eventually, if those events eventually lead to years down the road, something of that magnitude, it's too late. We already hit our reset point. So going forward, we're going to like, hey, like 6 months into this new year, into this particular timeline, we're going to end up resetting things because the world ends up getting blown up. So we'll fix things from our last checkpoint and try and make sure it doesn't happen. So that's how they'll tackle it. Even though something might have trickle effects years down the road, they'll deal with it at that point and not try and like go back. Once again, we don't even know the full capabilities of how far they could go back, even if they wanted to. So, but yeah, the whole thing is about stopping the end of the world. Not every bad thing, because I think it's too powerful to be using on everything. And then that's such, because I think they also do that because it's a slippery slope of, well, what events are you going to time travel back for? Because so-and-so died, someone you cared about died, which is going to be a crucial plot point to think about. And, preventing every terrible thing in the world, or just, it's a great power that has a great responsibility of, we only step in, we only interfere when things are so drastic, because it's about trying to let the world play out the way it's supposed to. Unless the world is ending, which it has apparently ended multiple times, even to the point Archie was like, in your timeline, in your lifespan, time is rewound like at least 20 times just in your lifespan, George. You only just remember these past 2 rewinds. So, and that's because he's a mutant, because something in his genes mutated to allow him to remember the timelines. But we find out from someone like Shiv, Shiv's been born like this. So he remembers in his time frame, he remembers every timeline when he was, that's also got to be a rough thing for him, because anytime time reset and he was a kid, like, how do you explain that without people thinking you're crazy? We don't know enough of his story. He seems so like disconnected from people, but it's like, considering his circumstances, you could tell like having an upbringing like that, being like this since you were born, is going to severely mess you. Think about that, like how severely, like the time most likely might have rewound just in like the time he was born and being a baby. You also get into the very existential and crazy science fiction of it all, of like, yo, what if you were unborn and then born again? It's like, once again, the wildness of what the time travel is in the show. It's just like the levels and layers to how it can work and how deep it can go, and just how crazy and how kind of effed up it can be utilized in like a being unborn and being born again type of situation. Arguably you could be like, look at Sarah, for example, being pregnant and now not being pregnant in, timeline C, which is what they were on for most of the episode. Because now Timeline C became Timeline A now, because they end up passing over to July 1st in 2023. So, which is kind of interesting, because like obviously, like, especially with the time frame of like, obviously, like this, at least here in the US, obviously, so they meant for the show to be like a year in advance for them. But it's so interesting that it's like, because of how long it took it to come here to the US, it's almost, because it is 2023, so it's funny how that works out like that. But they ended up dealing with the MERS situation, so that was kind of dealt with, so they didn't have to worry about it. It's also like, oh, why didn't you do anything about the coronavirus? She's like, you don't think we did anything? You got a cure in you got a vaccine in 9 months. And it's like, oh, so that was you. Once again, I love playing with like real world history in that regard, and just real life, especially something that's so recent and so fresh for so many people. So that's fascinating in its own right. So, but George was working at, doing a great job at the Lazarus Project, also living his life of Sarah, balancing both worlds. Obviously, he hates Carl because it's like, cool, in Timeline B, you and Sarah started dating. You wait till we broke up for you to kind of swoop in. So I was like, screw you. So when the time comes, he gives Carl some bad financial advice, because I was like, oh, that's probably going to bite you. Because I'm like, you can tell he's setting Carl up for a fall. And that severely screws him up, because Carl almost kills Sarah because he pushes her in a trash truck, almost hits her. But luckily George was there to stop it. But I'm like, you could, the moment they play that scene, you're like, that's definitely going to be like a very important scene and thing. But it's like, Carl was like, oh, I'm sorry. It's like, yeah, you idiot, you could have killed her. Because he's like, oh, like, it's definitely George. He did that. He did that on purpose. It's like, which we as the audience know, oh yeah, he did it. He even kind of made it clear to Carl, oh yeah, I did it on purpose. It's like, for one, no one told you to dump all your money into it. It's like, right, do a little bit, but he made it's like a short thing. It's like, yeah, but you weren't able to account for the fact that George doesn't like you because he already kind of had some issues with you, but he was fine with you because of Sarah. But now knowing like, oh, you dated Sarah, now seeing you for the opportunist that you are, he was just ready to just kind of stick it to you. He was just like, you're a selfish, like, weasel prick, so I hate you. So yeah, but the moment they show that scene, I was like, there's going to be a point where it doesn't play out with him saving her, sadly. But now they're going after, because they had introduced this story element of like a warhead or something called the Big Boy that went missing, and they didn't know if it was going to what it was going to turn out to be. But it turns out the person behind it is a guy named Dennis, or I think his name is Dennis Rebrov. But Rebrov used to be part of the team, so it's like, cool. So there's been people that have been a part of the Lazarus project who've gone rogue, and I can only assume Reprov's perspective is probably that thing of, it sucks that we don't deal with every tragedy. Yeah, we only step in for the big stuff, but what about all the, and it also comes down to how many people that are part of the Lazarus project, did they leave because of that? And and also like how many people had a personal situation, just like George does at the end, that might end up being a connected thread between him and Rebrov. We don't know what ended up causing him to leave, but even Shiv is like, yeah, him and Archie were like, yeah, there's been others that have left, but Shiv is like, but Rebrev is the worst of them. So it makes you wonder, what about the others? And it's like, because they were part of the Lazarus project, who knows if he was a mutant? He might have been like, which I do love them being like, Archie being like, yeah, but not like Wolverine. But yeah, whether he might have been a mutant, or maybe he's kind of like the others where he was chosen. But the question is, like, I guess once it's in your DNA, they don't have a process to remove it. So these people are out there in the world knowing every time the timeline gets reset. So, and that's the thing of like, yeah, that's what makes it dangerous when you have bad guys out there who have access to that technology. Also makes it a problem because, hey, the bad guys can adapt to what you're doing because, jumping ahead a little bit, they know where, like, Rebrov knows they're coming from because, like, oh, cool, you trapped me down before. Cool, timeline reset so I can be a step ahead of you. Now you will have to, like, track me down through lengthy processes again. The reason why they were able to find him is because George is, like, the algorithm he used for his app allowed him to pick up, and follow these unusual money transactions, and that eventually led to Rebrov. So it can work against him in the regards of, because he can always be like, okay, you caught me this time, and especially if he has that year time frame, it does give him a window of like, cool, if I can make it so that you have to reset the timeline, then I'm golden. I'm going to always put you in a position where I know you're going to have to. That's probably why he set things off the way he did, because he's like, I'm going to force you to have, because he knows their protocol, so he's like, if I do something big enough, you're going to have to reset the timeline if it's like something massive enough, like a warhead getting detonated type of situation. So, but yeah, they went to Paris to go after him, and basically he ended up killing everyone, including Archie. I'm like, well, that's the beauty of it. At least you'll be able to reset time. It's like, that's got to suck, because God knows how many times any of them have died. It's like, yeah, but you got to hope that you don't get caught in that time frame where it's like, hey, we can't reset at this point in time, which, once again, is going to play into the George stuff, but we'll get to that in a second. But obviously, that whole driving sequence with the Dane behind the wheel and George felt like, obviously, it felt like out of any like action sequence, but obviously immediately I start thinking of like some Uncharted vehicle sequences is what it kind of reminded me of. Yeah, the moment the Dane caught a bullet to the head and George is trying to stop him, that Debrev activates the device, and Wes has no choice. We're like, right, we got to activate a cold black. Like I said, I think it's like emergency time reset at this moment. It's like, all right, let's go ahead and pull the trigger on the reset now. And they rewind, and obviously they go back to July 1st, which it's interesting timing because George's reset point now is him in the middle of having sex with Sarah. I was like, that is such an interesting and awkward reset point. I mean, because it's always interesting to know what is the reset point for so many people. Like using Eureka, for example, Jack, his reset point was him taking a shower. That was the reset point, that every time he woke up, like he would find himself in the shower, like when he would. So it's just always interesting what that reset point is. And now your current reset point for the next year is you having sex with in the middle of having sex with your girlfriend, maybe nearing the end of it. So that's got to be weird, of transitioning from you dying from a nuclear explosion, and then like, waking up to like zapping back to the middle, if not the end of 3/4 of the way through you having sex with your girlfriend. Such a weird position to be in, so. But luckily, the team was able to get Rebrev. I did like that George kind of brought up, it's like, yeah, but if we had caught Rebrev, you'd still be dead. And Archie's like, don't think about it. It is that thing of like, yeah, because if they had caught Rebrev, they would have had no reason to reset the timeline, so the entire team would have stayed dead. It's like, regardless of what we want, there are just some casualties that just have to be. It's just like, right, the world isn't ending anymore, so there's no reason to reset. Now that's where George comes into the complicated spot of like, the moment he left Sarah, I was like, he doesn't remember. He's so caught up with everything else, because we don't know what the time frame was between July 1st and like, I mean, I don't know if that was like the same day or not, or maybe a couple days later, but with everything going on with Rebrev and everything, he completely forgot about what happened to Sarah, so it didn't even cross his mind, and this time she gets hit. They caught Rebrev, and so they're not going to want to reset, even though George is. So he's in a very complicated position of, this is the thing of the greater good means more than what you're going to like. Now, maybe Sarah's not dead, and maybe she's just going to be in the hospital or something. If that's the case, she might actually just be dead, because that's going to complicate things more. Maybe it's effed up to say he's lucky and she's only in the hospital. So, but it is at that reality you have to deal with, of unless it's a world ending event, they won't reset. And like I said, I think that's going to start putting George in this position that is going to come in contrast with like why Rebrev does what he does, or why maybe other members of the Lazarus Project have left over the years, because that is a hard pill to swallow, where it's just like, right, you just got to accept all these deaths that you could have done something about, you have the knowledge about, but you can't do anything about. We have access to time travel, but we can't use it in these more selfish things. Once again, it's got to be for the greater good, and only in moments where the world is ending, because we got to like not impact the timeline as much as possible. Only in world ending events do we step in. Every other tragedy, we just let be. So, I mean, that kind of flows with any time travel thing too. It's like, the whole point of time travel is to affect the timeline the least amount. Now, if we're talking about like something that's going to be world ending, obviously you got to step in. But if it's just like terrible tragedies, like you just gotta let, it's like, yeah, that's kind of like the supposed to be flow of time. The world's not supposed to end. But arguments could be like, well, if the world ended, maybe it was supposed to end. So it is still kind of selfish for you to make that. I mean, it works to everyone's benefit, but it enters that territory of, well, yeah, you stopped to save the world, but what about these other things? You could do so much good, but then it's like, we don't know, like I said, we don't know like the limitations of this, and how much of the more they time travel, the more they're breaking the space-time continuum. So that's why they have to limit how much they've used it, but they've used it quite a bit over the years. Once again, it's been around for quite a while, so that's where we start getting into those very like moral conundrums when it comes to time travel. And those are like the beautiful things, and like we really dive into that in like time travel science fictional stories like this. So I'm so excited to continue the show. I'm so excited to see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.